The Quinjet's engines hummed softly as Tony Stark adjusted the onboard scanner. Outside the cockpit, the forest stretched endlessly beneath the evening sky. A dense, dark sea of green broken only by the glint of the Blackwater River winding like a snake through the wilderness.
"All right, kid."
Tony said, not looking up from his console.
"The last energy signature we picked up was 2 miles south of the river. Banner's good at covering his tracks, but Gamma doesn't lie."
Peter Parker, seated across from him in his red and blue suit, fidgeted nervously.
I don't know, Mr. Stark. If it is the Hulk, shouldn't we have backup? Thor? Cap? Maybe even, I don't know, a tank.
Tony smirked, though it didn't quite reach his eyes.
"Banner's not going to wait for us to assemble the whole team, and we can't let this escalate. Besides, you've got me. I'm a one-man army, remember?"
Peter forced a smile, but his unease didn't fade. He'd seen the Hulk in action once before at the Battle of Sokovia. He still remembered the sheer force of it, the way the ground trembled with every step the Green Giant took. Now they were walking straight into Hulk's territory. The Quinjet touched down in a clearing on the outskirts of the forest. Tony activated the cloaking system before they stepped out. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and pine, and the distant sound of rushing water echoed through the trees. Tony adjusted the sensors in his suit.
"All right, we stick together, we keep quiet, and we don't provoke him. If Banner's in control, we reason with him. If not, we improvise."
Peter nodded, swallowing hard.
Got it.
They've entered into the forest, the underbrush crunching softly underfoot. The trees grew thicker as they moved further from the Quinjet, their branches intertwining to form a canopy that blocked out the last traces of daylight. Tony's suit provided a faint glow, but it wasn't enough to push back the oppressive darkness.
Mr. Stark, do you hear that?
Peter whispered, his voice barely audible. Tony stopped, tilting his head. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. Then, faintly, came a low, guttural growl. It was distant but unmistakable.
"Yeah, I hear it,"
Tony said, his voice tight. He raised his arm and the suit's repulsors hummed to life.
"Keep your eyes open."
They pressed on, the growl fading into silence. As they moved deeper into the forest, they began to notice signs of destruction. A tree, its trunk snapped clean in half. A boulder, split down the middle as if struck by an enormous fist.
This doesn't look like Banner trying to stay hidden,
Peter said, his voice trembling. Tony glanced at him.
"No, it doesn't. Stay close."
The growl returned, louder this time, and closer. Peter's spider sense tingled at the base of his skull, a warning that made his skin crawl.
Mr. Stark, I think.
Before he could finish, the ground beneath them shook violently. A deafening roar shattered the stillness, and from the shadows burst a massive figure. Hulk. Except, something was wrong. His skin, normally a vibrant green, was a sickly, mottled gray, streaked with dark veins that pulsed unnaturally. His eyes, glowing an eerie yellow, darted wildly between Tony and Peter. He looked more feral than ever before, his movements erratic, his breathing ragged and wheezing.
"Hulk?"
Tony said cautiously, raising his hands.
"It's us. It's Stark and Parker. We're here to help."
Hulk's head tilted as if he recognized the names, but his growl deepened, and he took a step forward, shaking the ground. Peter's heart pounded in his chest.
Mr. Stark, I don't think he's listening.
Tony barely had time to respond before Hulk charged.
"Move."
The two of them scattered as Hulk's massive fists slammed into the ground where they had been standing. The force sent dirt and debris flying, and the sound reverberated through the forest like a thunderclap. Tony fired a repulsor blast at Hulk, aiming to disorient him, but the beam barely faced the beast. Hulk roared again, swiping at Tony with a speed that seemed impossible for something his size. Peter shot a web at Hulk's face, hoping to slow him down, but Hulk tore through it effortlessly.
Not working, not working.
Peter shouted as he dodged another swing.
You think?
Tony snapped, deploying a small cluster of mini rockets. They detonated around Hulk, temporarily engulfing him in smoke.
Run.
Tony barked. They sprinted through the forest, the sound of Hulk's heavy footsteps close behind. Branches snapped and trees toppled as the enraged monster pursued them.
This wasn't in the plan.
Peter yelled, his breath coming in short gasps.
The plan's evolving.
Tony shot back, his suit's HUD struggling to keep up with Hulk's erratic movements. They burst into a small clearing, the Blackwater River glinting in the moonlight. Tony turned, raising his repulsors again, but Hulk didn't follow. Instead, he stopped at the edge of the clearing, his massive frame heaving with each breath. For a moment, they thought he might retreat. Then, from the shadows behind Hulk, came a sound that froze them in place, a low, guttural snarl, but not from him.
What the hell was that?
Peter whispered. Hulk turned slowly, his glowing eyes narrowing as the snarl grew louder. The shadows shifted, and something stepped into the moonlight. It wasn't human, it wasn't animal, and it wasn't alone. Tony's HUD lit up with warnings as gamma signatures spiked all around them.
Banner wasn't alone when he came back.
Tony said grimly.
And whatever followed him. It's not friendly.
The roar of the Hulk clashed with the snarls of the unseen creatures, and the forest descended into chaos. Tony's sensors were blaring warnings, the red overlays on his HUD marking multiple heat signatures surrounding them in the dense forest. He adjusted his posture, raising his repulsors cautiously as the first of the creatures stepped into view. It was massive, easily as tall as the Hulk, but thinner, its frame stretched unnaturally. Its skin was dark, leathery, and mottled with pulsating gamma-green veins that glowed faintly in the moonlight. Its head resembled a wolf's, but its eyes burned with the same eerie yellow light as Hulk's. A low, guttural growl rumbled from its chest, echoed moments later by several more snarls in the darkness.
Mr. Stark.
Peter's voice was shaky.
What are those things?
I don't know, kid.
Tony muttered, trying to keep his voice steady.
But I'm guessing they're not friendly.
Hulk turned toward the creature closest to him, his lips curling into a snarl.
Leave Hulk alone,
He rumbled, his voice distorted, strained. The creature didn't hesitate. With unnatural speed, it lunged at him, claws outstretched. Hulk caught it midair, the sheer impact of their collision shaking the ground. He slammed the creature into a nearby tree with a sickening crunch, but it barely seemed to feel the blow. It twisted in Hulk's grasp, biting into his arm with elongated fangs. Hulk roared in pain and rage, throwing the creature into the ground so hard the earth cracked beneath it.
Okay, that's our cue.
Tony said, activating his thrusters. He shot into the fray, firing a concentrated repulsor blast at one of the creatures emerging from the shadows. It let out a piercing howl as the energy scorched its side, but it didn't retreat. Instead, it turned its glowing eyes on Tony and bounded toward him with terrifying speed. Peter leaped into action, webbing another creature as it charged at Hulk.
I'm starting to think these things don't take no for an answer.
He quipped, though his voice was tinged with panic.
Just keep them off Hulk.
Tony shouted.
If these things overwhelm him, we're all done for.
Peter vaulted over one of the creatures, landing on a tree branch and firing a web at its face. The sticky strands temporarily blinded it, giving him a moment to assess the battlefield. There were at least 5 of the creatures now, maybe more lurking just out of sight. Hulk was doing his best to fend them off, but for every one he threw aside or smashed into the ground, another would leap onto his back or flank him.
Mr. Stark!
Peter shouted. They're not just attacking him, they're wearing him down. Tony gritted his teeth. He could see it too. Hulk's movements were slower, more erratic. His roars were tinged with pain, and his massive frame was littered with claw marks and bite wounds that glowed faintly with gamma energy.
They're draining him.
Tony realized, scanning the creatures more closely. His sensors confirmed it each time one of them struck Hulk, They absorbed a small amount of gamma radiation, their glowing veins pulsing brighter.
They're feeding off him.
Tony yelled. Peter's eyes widened.
So what do we do? If we keep fighting, won't we just make it worse?
Tony didn't have an answer. He fired another blast at a creature lunging toward Peter, sending it sprawling into the dirt.
We have to contain this.
Tony said, his mind racing.
If these things get out of this forest with gamma in them, they could become unstoppable. We can't let them escape, and we can't let them kill Banner.
Hulk let out another deafening roar, grabbing one of the creatures by its neck and slamming it into the ground repeatedly. Its body went limp, but the other creatures showed no signs of fear or hesitation.
All right, kid.
Tony said, landing beside Peter.
You distract them. I'll try to get Hulk out of here. We need to isolate him from these things before they suck him dry.
Peter blinked.
Distract them? You mean? Get chased by gamma-powered werewolf monsters? Great plan, Mr. Stark. Love it.
You're the fastest one here.
Tony said.
Just keep them busy for a few minutes. I'll owe you one.
Peter sighed.
You owe me a lot after this.
With that, he leaped from the tree, firing webs at two of the creatures circling Hulk.
Hey, ugly, over here.
The creatures turned toward him, their glowing eyes narrowing. Peter somersaulted through the air, leading them away from the clearing.
Okay, just gotta keep moving.
He muttered to himself.
Don't look back. Don't think about how fast they are. Don't.
A tree exploded beside him as one of the creatures swiped at him with a clawed hand. Peter yelped, narrowly dodging the attack and swinging higher into the canopy. Meanwhile, Tony landed near Hulk, who was staggering slightly.
Banner,
Tony shouted, hoping to reach the man inside.
you need to pull back. These things are using you.
Hulk's glowing eyes locked onto Tony, his expression a mix of confusion and fury.
Hulk! Fights!
He growled, slamming his fists into the ground.
No, big guy.
Tony said.
Not this time.
Before Hulk could respond, Tony activated a pulse emitter in his suit. A shockwave of energy burst outward, momentarily stunning the creatures and causing Hulk to stumble.
All right, big guy.
Tony muttered, locking onto Hulk's massive frame with a tractor beam.
Time for a tactical retreat.
The beam struggled to lift Hulk off the ground, but Tony's suit strained to keep him aloft. Hulk roared in protest, thrashing against the pull, but Tony didn't let go.
Kid, I've got him.
Tony shouted into his cum.
Just keep those things busy a little longer.
Easier said than done.
Peter replied, dodging another swipe. As Tony dragged Hulk toward the river, the creatures began to recover from the shockwave. Their glowing eyes turned toward the retreating figures, and they let out unearthly howls. Peter swung back into the clearing, landing near the riverbank.
Mr. Stark, they're regrouping. What's the plan?
Tony glanced at his HUD, scanning for anything they could use. His eyes landed on the river.
We lead them into the water.
Tony said.
Gamma radiation doesn't conduct well in moving currents. It might weaken them.
Peter nodded.
Worth a shot?
As the creatures closed in, Peter and Tony worked together to lure them toward the riverbank. The first creature leaped into the water after Peter, but as soon as it hit the rushing current, its glowing veins dimmed and its movements became sluggish.
It's working.
Peter shouted. One by one, they forced the creatures into the river, using webs and repulsor blasts to knock them off balance. Hulk, now calmer, watched from the bank, his glowing eyes dimming slightly as the creature's energy faded. Finally, the last of the creatures was swept away by the current, their howls fading into the distance. Tony collapsed onto the ground, his suit sparking from overuse. Peter sat beside him, breathing heavily.
Well,
Peter said.
That was horrifying.
Tony chuckled weakly.
Welcome to the Avengers, kid.
Hulk sat nearby, his massive frame slumped. For a moment, he looked almost peaceful. But Tony knew this wasn't over. Whatever those creatures were, they weren't natural. And if they came once, they could come again.
Let's get Banner somewhere safe.
Tony said, standing.
We've got a lot of questions to answer.
Peter nodded, glancing warily at the forest.
And maybe we avoid forests for a while?
Agreed.
Tony said, as the three of them disappeared into the night.